Welcome back to another episode of the All Things Interesting podcast, where I talk with guests from a wide variety of backgrounds to share with you their unique stories and to explore incredibly interesting topics. On this episode of the show, I am joined by independent researcher, writer, programmer, and open source operative Moritz Bierling to talk about all things the second brain, human agency, blockchain technology, community building, plus a whole lot more. It's a worthwhile listen for anyone who is looking to learn more about how they can maximize their productivity or become more empowered in their daily lives. That said, if you enjoyed the episode or the show, feel free to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform and drop a comment. With that said, please enjoy this amazing conversation with my guest, Moritz Bierling.
I'll just set up the standing desk so that I can stand because that'd be much more enjoyable.
Is standing easier for you when you're talking to people? I noticed that in the other video, like we were standing the whole time.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if that was like walking. A method. Is that easier way to kind of convey your thoughts or to think?
Not necessarily convey, but to think myself. So because something happens when you're in motion, it activates sort of the cognitive processes of technique and of activity and sort of forward motion, and so when you're sitting, you're sort of static, and so you're also like a different kind of cognitive machinery is active than when you're acting.
Okay, so I was always wondering, why is it that people who are presenting or who are on stage, they would pace back and forth and move their arms around while they're explaining the topic? I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Huh.
Yeah, I find that the best conversations, phone calls, or stuff like that actually happens when you have the ability to move around. Like when I have calls with people right now, I just pace around the terrace here back and forth, and it's amazing. Actually, Stephen Wolfram, this genius, he has this weird thing. He basically has a sort of treadmill kind of thing, but instead of an actual treadmill, it's sort of like a walking desk. So you have a desk that you can move, and while you're moving, you can type and do stuff. So I don't know.
That is awesome. Not only are you working out, but you're being able to actively think and talk at the same time. That's awesome. Yes. So we might as well just dive into things here. I assume you've gotten your setup corrected?
Yep, I'm ready.
Awesome. So we'll just kind of dive into the conversation now. So for listeners out there, my guest today is Moritz Bierling. Apologies if I've butchered their name slightly.
That was correct.
And you are considered to be an independent researcher, speaker, and writer, reporter, as well as co-founder of some companies. But you describe yourself to be a generalist most of all, meaning that you kind of move around from different topics or different fields of interest. And just to kind of tie things in here, I was introduced to you by Roshan Terrell, and I had him on as a guest of the show a while back, talking about AI and really interesting, fascinating theories about the mind, neurons, and intelligence. And he recommended you be on the show today, and I thought that was a really good idea, as I've done quite a bit of research on you, and you have a very fascinating background and set of theories and ideas yourself. To kind of put some context into how we're going to drive this conversation, I personally started this podcast as a medium for which I could break out and grow from my very structured career path. I've used it as a foundation to learn different things such as marketing, communication, researching, developing, building a website, building a brand, ultimately. And there were some commonalities in the direction that you took, because people often follow a set path through life in which they choose a focus area. So, to really just jumpstart the conversation, what would you say was your biggest motivation behind choosing a non-linear approach to the work you do?
Hmm. Well, I'm not sure that I ever chose that path that consciously. It was more of a natural emergence from a couple of key decisions I made that ended up with me going down this road, if you will. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
actually went down a somewhat conventional path, at least if you consider sort of the regular school to university route, the regular route, and I think many people do. Um, and when I finished high school, I was one of the top male students in my year um, in my in my school, and I'd worked 2 hard years. The last 2 years, I had worked hard to get there and to be able to qualify for university and sort of better programs. And I got into one of those programs, philosophy and economics, like a unique program in the German-speaking world. And so I was definitely on that path, like the normal path, going to university, getting the degree, maybe getting the second degree, a master's degree, doing some, I don't know, NGO work on the side or while you're studying, and then going to regular jobs. But a couple of things happened that sort of threw a wrench into that, and ended up with me going down to Chile of all places.
What exactly happened in Chile? Because I noticed this trend with people I've talked to, in the sense of, well, I didn't necessarily choose the work I'm doing or the career path I'm in. I kind of just naturally fell into it.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you're describing it right now is that you fell into a different career path,
Mm-hmm.
specifically with going to Chile. So what exactly happened there
Right,
that changed the path?
right. So having chosen the first study program, philosophy and economics, and having dropped out of that after one semester, thanks to both a book and a conversation with my mother that helped me realize I was depressed there.
Hmm.
um,
What book was this?
this was Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. Have you heard of that before?
I have not heard of that book before. Could you
Oh,
describe real quick
yeah,
what it is?
absolutely. So Nassim Taleb is this pretty interesting guy who's a contrarian. Uh, contrarian is probably the best description. Um, and he got famous after having been a day trader for 20 plus years for writing a series of books, the first of which I think was Fooled by Randomness, um, where he talks a lot about how what people consider to be serious trends in statistics are often just um, aren't actually real trends, and that we're often fooled by randomness, as the title says. The second one was
Mm.
the black swan, that was sort of an extension of that, thinking that there is a category of events, black swans he calls them, that are of outsized importance and impact, and that dwarf sort of the regular events that are happening and that are unpredictable. So, for example,
Right. Like
the
COVID-19 would be a black swan event.
sort of. Actually, since then, the intellectual landscape has termed what Taleb would now call here a black elephant, in the sense like it was clear that something like this was going to happen, but nobody knew when. So, because we are in this super connected world today, global world of people and data and where flows from one place to the other, massive networks, and so with that increased connectivity, it's only a matter of time that when something happens somewhere, it'll spread globally. So, but
Hmm.
yeah, so that book that I read, Anti-Fragile, was his follow-on to Black Swan, and it specifically discussed this property of anti-fragility, which sounds weird at first, but it's basically the opposite of fragility. And when people think of fragility, they think of its opposite as robustness, right? Like when you think of a vase, for
Yeah,
example, a
yeah.
vase, when you push a vase off a table, it breaks pretty easily. It's just very fragile.
Hmm.
So you would think that the opposite of that is robustness, that if something stressful, something hard, something damaging happens to it, it can resist it. But actually, the opposite of fragile isn't robustness, but according to him, it's anti-fragility, as in it grows stronger when it gets pushed, when it gets damaged, when it gets attacked, when it gets exposed to stress, wear, and time. And so
Hmm.
he traces that idea back to the ancients in all their different civilizations, but they never had a name for that, at least not this name. And it is what is the shared property of all living systems that grow and that stay alive over time. So, for example, I'll give you a concrete example. When you go to work out at the gym, what you're doing on a muscular level is you're hurting your muscles to a minute degree. And because you're introducing little tears into the muscle fiber grows back, but just a bit stronger, like 20% or whatever the number is. But it's a compensation effect for the damage in anticipation of further wear in the future. And so this property works by the small constituent parts that make up a larger system being relatively fragile on their own, but the full
Hmm.
system being pretty anti-fragile as a result of the fragility of the small systems. Another good example is restaurants, right? Like the likelihood for any restaurant to stay in business further than a year or two is like 10%, 5%. So most restaurants go out of business pretty quickly. It's just a difficult business. But because there's so much turnover, there's so much trial and error, and so much learning happening, you get a pretty vibrant and alive industry where you can have amazing service, amazing food, amazing experiences as a result, and also a stable provision of those services as a result of all that trial and error and all that learning taking place. So, yeah, that's sort of a pretty good
It sounds like kind of I wouldn't say it's Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, but more of we're the architects of ourselves and we have to break down ourselves to build ourselves stronger ultimately. I like the example you really used of building
right,
muscles. When you go to the gym, you break down your muscles and they
right,
form even stronger. It's also similar to breaking a bone. When you break the bone in your leg, for example, it typically fuses back stronger. So by
right,
introducing
right.
very minuscule amounts of stress or damage, you're building at least the body in this case to be a bit stronger than it
Yes.
was before. How did this influence you prior to moving to Chile, would you say?
Mm. So basically, that book when I was studying that book came out when I was studying in Bavaria, this philosophy and economics degree,
Mm-hmm.
and it presented both this idea, yes, this core idea, but this sort of ancillary to that of practical learning and learning by doing being to some extent superior or at least as important as learning from theory and sort of passive learning or learning through second-hand understanding knowledge. So
Mm.
what I retrospectively realized was happening at the time was that I was engaged in a study program that combined two pretty theoretical subjects, philosophy and economics, and I was well on my way to a path of academia, of like going further down this theoretical route, learning through books, learning through writing, learning through thinking, learning from professors, but not on a path towards learning from people who are actively engaged in bringing about change in some way, shape, or form. Not necessarily change on a societal level, but just doing things in the world that move people, that move things. And so at the time, I think I was becoming depressed because as I read that book and as I learned and realized and appreciated how crucial it is to learn from experience, from actual sort of conversation with reality, let's say, not conversation with thoughts about reality. I think that was in opposition to that path I was on with the philosophy and economics degree, and also with my very strong internal tendency and personality trait of wanting to learn a lot about the world. And so the fastest way is often to just read about it. And so I think that was contributing to me becoming depressed. And so when I went back to Hamburg to go for the semester break with my parents, my mother actually, to which I'm still really, really grateful to her to this day, helped me realize in a long conversation that I was not happy there. And ultimately, we decided together I would quit that program, come back home, figure out a different path. And the different path that I then chose, informed by this realization that practical learning is of the utmost importance, at least to me now, was that I would study a dual study program. And this is one of those really unique things to the German-speaking world that I don't think anywhere else in the world exists, which is a combination of working as an employee at a company as well as studying as a student at a university, combined in a 3-year program where the company pays your salary, pays for your tuition, gives you 3 years of work experience, and at the end of those 3 years you also have a regular bachelor's degree in the chosen field. And so at the end of 3 years, you come out with all of that and generally also an offer to continue your job at the company and move up. And so that's an incredible program, and I recommend it to anybody who can do it, but that's what I chose. But because I had already started the sort of path, this intellectual path of heterodoxy, partially inspired by Taleb and his book Anti-Fragile, I continued the search for other ways of viewing the world, other theories, other writings that were not part of the established mainstream canon. And so I delved into subjects like libertarianism, anarchism, Austrian economics, cryptocurrency, and so on and so on. And so part of that research and that search for things that matter, let's say, and that take a different approach to all the normal subjects, led me to find a lot of different niche groups on the internet. And one of those was Exosphere, this community of this learning and problem-solving community down in Chile, started by an American in 2012. And when I came across their writings, I was so drawn to that, the ethos with which they were written, which was talking a lot about entrepreneurialism, self-reliance, becoming a man not only of your word, but also a man of action. And not only doing that in this radically individualistic way, which is sort of this quintessential American dream, like I for myself, but doing it, yes, for yourself, but with others. And so there was a combination.
So that's the key. That's the key point, though, right?
Yes.
Is that the key point you're trying to make? It's not just being an individual, but it's including others in a collaborative way to build value.
Yes, I think it's absolutely crucial. I think it's something that, had I known that earlier, I would have much more readily sought out contexts where that was the case. And yeah, there's so much that is implicit in relationships that you learn when you're around other people that you just don't get from being on your own. And of course, I intensely appreciate the value of going on your own, like going for yourself, going on your own path. But the thing that then drew me to Exosphere, and that also ultimately made me decide to commit to staying in Chile after having quit my second study program and going to their life entrepreneurship bootcamp down in Chile for 2 months, was this experience of community building. I don't know whether you've ever heard of circling.
I have not. What is it?
So there's been some interesting work done by M. Scott Peck, this American psychologist and author who came from the Christian tradition, but who took a secular approach to psychotherapy and to communal dynamics. And so in the 60s, I think there was a lot of energy, cultural energy for like going a different route. Like you had the hippies, you had all of these people trying to form their own communities. And a lot of those things go great at the beginning, but they radically fail very quickly as soon as the cult dynamics come into play, and the leader like takes access to sex from all the groupies that are there, and all this kind of stuff happens. And so I don't know that this was necessarily an inspiration for him to research it, but America has always struggled with this trade-off between group and individual. And so his work focuses a lot on, first, how to actually become an individual, because people, even though they are on their own, they're not often or always individuals. They haven't individuated in the strict psychological sense of that word. They haven't themselves questioned and sort of penetrated and then integrated all the norms and traditions and blind assumptions that are part of their culture, their family, their school, their region, their ethnicity, their religion.
Can you elaborate on that exactly?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
There's a typical definition of like what an individual is, but in this case, it seems like M. Scott Peck is defining individualism in a different form. What do you mean exactly by that?
Right. So when you are born and you start your way into life, you are radically dependent on other people. First and foremost, your parents, and then as time goes on, as you become part of society progressively, you are exposed to and also at the mercy of other people's good disposition towards you. And so as you are learning to become independent or become at least capable of providing for yourself on some basic level, you are required to pay attention to and to give credence to and to just accept whatever other people do, say, and believe. Because if you don't, you are producing a sort of surface area for attack, where if you don't share this belief, you might not get access to this little group. Like the prototypical example of this is the high school, where especially in American society, you have this very strong stereotypical separation of the jocks, the nerds, the art people, and so
right,
on.
like cliques in school, like
exactly.
Different, like yeah.
Exactly. And so what these provide to you is strong templates for behavior, right? Like if you want to be part of the jock group, you have to be buff, you have to be cool, and you have to like have some at least perceived level of confidence. I'm not sure that they necessarily have confidence, but in any case, like some kind of brashness, boldness. And so when you get access to those groups, that's great. Like you perform a role, and that role has a template. It means that there are certain things that are required of you to fill that role and to stay part of that group. And so if you deviate from that script, if you choose to display or mix different traits, mix different things, then you are likely not to fit to any group, and you're going to be socially isolated. And so as you grow up and as you learn how the world works, you always have the incentive of playing by the rules of some social space, whatever it may be. And so as you become more capable of providing for yourself by, for example, driving, right? Like this is huge rite of passage in American society, learning to drive. In lieu of others, we don't really have many anymore, unfortunately. You learn how to take on the basic functions of providing for your life, and so you are less dependent on other people, and that opens up a space of possibility for you to experiment with the things that you enjoy, the things that you like, the things that you don't like, and forming an individual perspective, an individual, let's say, discipline or operative framework, like something where you're doing it yourself. You're making your life into your own rather than choosing the regular script that is being given to you. And of course, we have very strong scripts still today, although they're rapidly fading away thanks to the internet. And so one of those big scripts is, of course, the kindergarten to high school to university to first job pipeline. And it doesn't stop there. It goes from first job, second job, etc., all the way through to retirement and then sort of early death.
That is really interesting. I mean, the way I'm hearing it right now is that the individualism you're describing is to force yourself out of a reliance on others or a dependency on others to form your opinions or your thoughts or your actions. So by putting yourself in a position, for example, like you mentioned, driving a car, or even with starting a podcast, if I can throw that example in there, you have to really take ownership of your choices or your thoughts or your opinions and develop them or empower yourself to be responsible for those choices without the reliance of others.
Absolutely.
And the way you described it with going through grade school and college and then into the workplace and being placed into certain groups who have their defined identities or, I guess, specific roles, it takes away your ability to have your own identity and to have your own thoughts and feelings and opinions.
Right. And it gives you something too. Like, this is the other thing. Like, I'm not saying this necessarily out of a resentment for how society forces me into a role. Like, it's just the way it is. Like, in order for somebody to want to be around you, you have to fulfill some basic requirements. We all have those requirements. It's just that when you take this phenomenon and you see it in all of society, and you are trying to give a large society, like 320 million, I think, is the US now, population, and you want to have some kind of way for all of those millions and millions of people to be able to understand and be around each other peacefully. There have to be some base shared assumptions for me to understand, like, how I can sort of interact with you. So if you say you are a college student, I immediately get, with just those two words, a pretty good idea of what your lived reality is like, and so I can have an intelligent conversation with you about, like, what are your goals, like, where do you want to, like, work later, and so all of these assumptions are there, and that's great. But the problem then comes when you fit yourself to those roles, and that's fine, but you fit yourself to those roles, and then you forget that there's more. And sometimes these roles can become so all-consuming that you're sort of stuck in that mask that you put on to go to work, and everything sort of loses its meaning, because no longer are you the prime determining factor in your destiny, but it's more somebody else's needs that you're serving.
I can see that, but one of the things that really comes to mind here is that we as humans are intrinsically social beings. We are attracted to those that are like-minded, who share the same ideas, and from this it forms sort of different groups based off religion, say based off social standing or economic standing or specific views, and you can keep breaking that down. So I think the question becomes here, if it's something that is so inherently ingrained in human behavior to commune, I suppose, how do you break out of that without totally disregarding that inherent behavior? How do you value social community while also empowering individuality at the same time?
I think that's the $1 million question. And I'm not sure there's, like, the one answer, but I think so. It is sort of the question that Peck really really investigate it. And his answer, at least, and I would concur to a meaningful extent, I'm not sure 100%, but his actual answer to this is in and through community lies the salvation of the world. That's what he says in that book. I think a different drum. I think that's where he talks about community building. And he says this with a sense that, so basically, I'll just describe what community building is and how it works. So people can have dialogue like you and I are having right now, and it's great where we can focus on each other's speech. We can really get into depth into what we are feeling and saying and seeing in the world. And so take this concept of dialogue and let's say extend it to a larger group, for example, 30 people. And in that larger group, you won't have an easy time having everybody speak the same amount and listen everybody to everybody else. And so what circling or community building does is it puts 30 people in a room on chairs in a circle. And then there's one or two facilitators and a set of 15 guidelines, not rules, but guidelines. And those guidelines are going to be read at the beginning of the first session. And these sessions can usually go for 1.5 hours. And usually you do community building for at least half a day, sometimes for 2 days, sometimes even longer. So it's quite a time investment for everybody involved. And when those guidelines are read, then the facilitators go silent, and then the space is open, and there's no agenda, there's no goal, there's just the people, and it's fascinating.
That must be challenging, though.
Oh yeah, super challenging.
So, how do people really just start a conversation if they list the rules and go silent? Like, how do you know what to talk about?
Exactly. And so some people, this is the interesting thing. So depending on the makeup of the group, what kind of people there are, because they're always different from group to group, a completely different dynamic will emerge. And so sometimes you have like a bunch of extroverts, let's say, who are just uncomfortable as hell with silence. And so they'll just start talking about something, and then they'll descend into some kind of vapid intellectual exercise, or, okay, what are we trying to do here? And sort of it just goes into some direction. Not wrapping on extroverts here, but some dynamic will emerge. And sometimes, actually, you will also have silence. And actually, when we did this with a group of women that we had come to one of our programs, actually, they had the longest silence that any of us ever experienced, of like 7 hours, which is just insane.
No way.
Yes.
Was it a comfortable silence, or was it like
no? I don't think so. I wasn't actually part of that session, but it was told to me as being extremely uncomfortable. Yeah. But
I can't imagine sitting there for that long doing that. But, yeah. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just give an account of what at least the theory behind this is, and then also how my experience maps to that. So the theory behind what happens in community developed by Peck, and as the result of his participation, facilitation, and then observation of what happens in those circles, is that there are roughly 4 distinct stages. And so the first stage is pseudo-community. Pseudo being the operative word here. So when people are around each other, especially when they're new to each other, they don't know each other that well, they will default to a polite but ultimately meaningless conversation. So they'll just talk about whatever's on their mind, whatever is like safe, where no conflict will emerge.
Superficial conversation, very
exactly, like typical small talk, let's say. But that runs out of steam, like the small talk at least, relatively quickly, especially if you're part of a 30-people group where only one person can feasibly speak at a time. And so as the first fault lines start to emerge, you will tend to get into conflict. And this can like there's no set time that any of these stages take. It's extremely dependent on the individuals and then their interactions with each other. And so as conflict emerges, you will have people arguing with each other. The first time, like somebody says something and then the other person's like, no, I don't actually agree with that. Like, what are you talking about? And so conflict will emerge.
Is that the second stage?
Yes, second stage, exactly. And so but all of these stages can go into all of the other stages. So it's not a strict linear model. The third stage is emptiness. And in emptiness, the conflict that was previously reigning in this sort of regular progression, let's say, exhausts itself, and people fall silent as they are focusing more on the internal conflict or internal dialogue, let's say, and or they actually realize they don't want to talk and they would rather listen, which is a very interesting psychological shift. Like lots of the time when people talk with each other, when the other person is talking, the only thing that they're doing most of the time is waiting to get their word in and to say what is on their mind, that what the other person said made them associate. And so what you learn in community as well, implicitly, although it's not an explicit goal, is how to listen actively and listen well. And so oftentimes it's actually not that helpful or even necessary to say anything, even when the other person says something extremely meaningful. And so when emptiness runs its course and people are sort of, let's say, they've opened themselves to the group on a fundamental sort of hard level, they start to become more attuned to what wants to happen in the group rather than what they want to talk about. And so people will start to be sensitive and looking towards what are the other people feeling like and what is sort of the strongest pull right now. And so when that happens, you enter what's called actual community, so community. And so in community, people have an active sense of openness towards others. They are not trying to get their word in. And this group feeling emerges of, I am in a safe space where I can be vulnerable and I can allow other people also to be vulnerable. And I don't have to react to anything, but I can react to everything. But genuinely, not out of a social convention like, oh, you said something so beautiful and now you need to clap, which is a social convention, not an actual spontaneous human reaction. And so community is one of those strange human experiences.
Right. It sounds like it's breaking down the barriers of insecurity and our natural humanistic behaviors in social settings. Like you mentioned, like if you're in a meeting with people, you have the natural inclination to be respectful, to be professional, and you don't want to start conflict. But when put in a situation where you're not in a professional setting, for example, you have more freedom to have conflict. But even going below that, there's the emptiness like you mentioned, and then that leads to freedom to communicate and to listen and to break down those walls of insecurity and to let yourself be open to other ideas. Do I have that kind of in a right context here?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's actually also crucial here also that there's no agenda to this community building. So, I mean, of course, there's the name community building, so people get a sense of what sort of this is about. But because there's no goal to it, and the guidelines don't actually give you a game, a social game that you can play, but just awarenesses to keep in mind. The sort of just regular humanness can emerge rather than a professional mask or a social role or so the people just conforming to the expectations of a particular given context where, of course, nobody wants to waste each other's time. And so people will just default to the safe thing. And so this is a space that makes it possible to be radically unsafe while still being safe. And that's what the facilitators are there for as well, because they are more experienced participants in community building, and they are aware of and capable in intervening when things go out of hand. And things can get out of hand. Like I have sat in community sessions where the conflict got so strong that people break down crying, or they leave the room, or get up. And so it is an actual human engagement with each other, and that always carries the risk of disagreement, of conflict, and of raised voices, let's say. But it also, because it is so radically open, it also holds the capacity to bring people closer together. And so I've seen people of all ethnic backgrounds, all religious persuasions, all familial backgrounds, and so on, whatever category you can imagine, come into this space without the intention of trying to necessarily understand each other better, and leave with a sense of appreciation, if not for thinking that the other person is a great person, but at least understanding that they're as human as they are, and that the reason they are a certain way lies in their past rather than in some kind of essence that defines them. And so I think that's really powerful.
Wow. I'm sort of at a loss for words, because I think that is a very beautiful experience, to say the least. And like you said, there's no really predefined agenda or goal. So it does run the risk of backfiring and inciting conflict.
Right.
But if you're able to break through those levels and go deeper, then it does have the ability to bring people together in a very positive human way. Like you're breaking down barriers and understanding individuals for their true selves, not by some religion, not by race, color, whatever it may be, but you're truly just there to listen and connect with others strictly as human beings.
Right.
I'm curious to how you tie this together in the sense of you've participated in these events based off what you described. How have they really influenced your life in a positive manner, would you say?
Yeah, so it was in community building, which was just one of the dozens and dozens of activities we went through in that boot camp, and that I also later organized myself as an organizer of those boot camps. It was in community building that I think I learned most what it means to be self-reliant, what it means to be an entrepreneur. And that's because I had gone through sales training, and we were doing all these kinds of challenges of for example, buying a couple of t-shirts and then having a small budget and to make them attractive, and then go out on the street in Chile where we know nobody and we don't necessarily speak the language, and try to sell those to strangers and then win the most money. That was one of the activities we did, and dozens like that around different subjects. But the thing that I think really made me most entrepreneurial on an embodied level, not on an intellectual understanding level, was community building. Because what entrepreneurship to me means is a radical acceptance and commitment to personal growth as it is required of you when you start a business, when you build a company, when you try to bring something into the world that doesn't exist yet, because it requires that of you. Because if you don't do that, it will fail. You are always the bottleneck of the growth of your company, of the growth of your business, of the growth of your life, of course. And so in community, I learned how to recognize in myself, let's say, the dead parts, or the parts that are holding me back to some degree, which often revolve around other people, of course, and your willingness to be vulnerable with them, but also the willingness to stand up for yourself too. It's basically always about, should I build up this boundary, or should I tear down this boundary? Or should I build up this structure, or should I tear down the structure? And actually, Jordan Peterson, somebody who has shot into the limelight in the last 2 to 3 years, and a fascinating philosopher and also psychologist. He talks a lot about how the Christian mythos really goes deeply into this fundamental capacity. It glorifies this idea of death and rebirth. Of course, many religions do that, but in Christianity, it really makes it a centerpiece of the theology that Christ dies for your sins and is reborn as a result of it. And it's this beautiful metaphor for us having to die for like the true or best selves that we can be by killing off or just sacrificing the parts of us that are no longer alive to the world, let's say. And so I think that's what happens in community, that you're becoming attuned to when you yourself act from convenience, from habit, from social expectation, from role, versus when you act from spontaneous eruption of recognition or from spontaneous inspiration. And so it attunes you to that. And so when you do that, you remove limits that were previously holding you back, and you build up boundaries that allow you to also defend the space that others would obviously intrude upon if you were just a pushover. And so those, I think, are the two key capacities you need to build a powerful structure, be that your business, your company, your life, a relationship, whatever.
I'm going to pause you for a moment because this is very interesting, and I like how you kind of paralleled the idea of death and rebirth to entrepreneurship in the sense that you need to have this radical acceptance to personally grow, and connecting that with this community idea. Can you provide an example of how you were prior to this, prior to ever taking part in the community aspect of it all, and what kind of came about it? What would you say were some of the outputs of this rebirth for yourself, or being able to explore this individuality
Absolutely.
and to take that into your entrepreneurial work, really?
Yes. So before I went to Chile, as I already sort of alluded to, I had this strong analytical disposition of sort of taking information. It was really my main mode. I would even describe it as my drug of choice. Like some people do cocaine, some people do ecstasy. Like I do information, and
like an information sponge, really.
Yeah, I was always a bookworm, but when I continued that research I was inspired to do after reading Anti-Fragile, I also came across a podcast that I ended up actually listening over 1,300 episodes of each half to an hour long for in the span of 9 months. I was basically doing nothing else than that and studying.
Whoa.
And eating, sleeping, and working. And so I was addicted to information, truly addicted to information. And I think it was because I had nobody around me in my social life that I could have conversations with at a level and focused on the subjects that I found meaningful and interesting. Like I had some friends, yes, and I could have philosophical conversations with them sometimes, but especially towards the end of my school life, I drifted away from them and they drifted away from me. The sort of predominant culture in my high school became one of drinking, vomiting, drinking, and sort of just continuing that cycle. It wasn't really interesting to me. And so I basically chose to find my stimulation elsewhere. And in the internet provided that. And I think that's actually a quite common theme now. I think it's been it's become common ever since the internet started.
I think that's a great example because I can attest to that as well, that we try to find community and social connection with those around us and our friends, but the reality is that not everyone is going to be able to provide that deep connection with the ideas or interests that you personally have. So we find escape through different mediums like YouTube or podcasts or movies or books or games or whatever it may be, because those are so attuned to what we're inherently interested in. So we kind of go down this rabbit hole into that, and I guess segregate ourselves from the rest of the world, because those are the only things that are really providing us that intellectual stimulation that we're naturally yearning for.
Right. And it has an inherent danger, which is that there's no limiting factor. Like the internet is forever and it's endless. Like you can go on and on and on. There's no rate limiter other than your capacity to take in more. I mean, even like if you think about the social level, like there's always a limiter to the sense that people will get tired of talking with you, or you will need to eat, or like there's all these things that make it natural to move from one mode into another and then back. And so what the internet provides is basically an escape from all of those routine, quote unquote, boring activities. And also you can actually do, for example, podcasts are so popular because you can do them with nearly every other activity other than speaking to somebody. And so I was really going down that route because I had nobody around me, and it ultimately ended up, like the internet ended up pulling me into this weird direction of not following the standard script, because I was inspired by people who had chosen different paths, and because I think on some deep level sense that there are people out there that I can't yet imagine meeting or knowing what they're like, but that exist because I've seen strange people on the internet do interesting things. And so there must be some base reality on which that is possible. And so ultimately, when I met those people in Exosphere, this community, I latched onto that and I jumped into it head first. And I'm happy for having made that decision today, for sure.
I think that's fascinating, though. I mean, one of the things you pointed out is being able to deep dive into the internet and find all these topics that align with what your interests are, but there is a sense of community there. I know you mentioned that you have access to all these forms of media that show that there are people out there who share the same interests, but even below that, Moritz, is that there are communities who are dedicated to these topics of interest. So you go on Reddit and there's subreddits that contain everything from podcasting to movies to art to video games to politics, you name it. So even though you can independently become absorbed in listening to podcasts, there are communities out there that still discuss these things. So in a sense, you're still able to kind of have these conversations and to express your creativity and your freedom of thought with individuals who are like-minded in that sense.
Absolutely. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing because it gives you this sense of that I'm not alone. I'm not the only weird kid in school, even though you may be the only weird kid in school in your school.
Right.
But then there's also a danger again with that, because by getting that online validation from people who you have never met face to face, who you don't have an actual relationship with, and who don't necessarily have your best interests in mind or at heart, you can get stuck in this sort of shallow sense of, okay, there are people out there that care about the same things, but I'm not able to connect with them on a deeper level than messaging threads. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think the next step from that ideally would be to find actual people and to have real relationship with them. And of course, people move away from home to go to college, and that's usually where they find then a new set of people that challenge them differently, that inspire them differently, that they have new relationships with, where they can, again, for the first time probably in their life, experiment with the identities and the roles they can fill. And so that's ideally what the goal would be, for people to, yes, get that sense that there's more out there, pursue that, and then by experimenting with it, find the people that really connect with you on a deeper level.
I agree with that statement. I think there's so much out there for people to see. And especially with information. I know we can become overwhelmed in the vast amount of it available in just so many different forms, from videos to articles to notes to whatever it may be, that it could become overwhelming. And this sort of ties into another topic I wanted to bring up, because before this we were having some conversations, and you brought up an individual by the name of Tiago Forte. And I looked into his work, and it was very interesting. It wasn't necessarily revolutionary, but he talked about, I suppose it's a framework or process called the second brain. And you took part in his course building a second brain at one point. So I kind of wanted to dive into this because it is a framework that describes how people can absorb information and organize it in such a way that enables them to maximize their output. And I know you're talking a lot about information becoming absorbed in certain interests in building communities. And this topic kind of is a segue into what is really the second brain approach, and what have been your experiences with taking this information and actualizing it into valuable outcomes.
Yes, I think that transitions perfectly. I mean, when you have found people online like, oh wow, there's more out there, then what do you do with that? do you descend into this absolutely crazy podcast binge that I did, where like it actually put at risk my studies even, and the work that I was doing, or do you find a way to tie that into real world pursuits? And that was actually the one of the core insights at this workshop that I did with the Exosphere people that ended up with me going to Chile, was that I realized, wow, I'm actually addicted to information, and I don't know how to navigate and steer my consumption of information in a way that facilitates my growth and my pursuit of goals, rather than acting as a sort of drug to numb my pain in some way. And so the building a second brain approach, this or the framework, is Tiago's abstraction of principles and observations out of his own work with productivity, where he went and started this company, Forte Labs, in San Francisco after having done a couple of other smaller things. And he started to write about how to organize yourself, how to, for example, get to inbox zero, how to keep a running task list, like the sort of typical GTD or getting things done framework. And so he started to write about that. He started to conduct workshops on that. And he started to get paid for helping other people organize themselves. And especially in Silicon Valley, it's of course very valuable to be able to organize yourself well, because time is extremely valuable there. So if you know how to make the most use of your time, you're going to be very happy to pay somebody to help you make more out of that time. And so with that context, he started to see patterns at work that really decide or to determine whether you're capable of dealing with that information deluge that is hitting all of us on all channels all day, every day. I mean, people who are born and raised in the US and who have rarely gone outside of it don't even realize how effing weird it is to have a TV on in virtually all areas of life, like in airports, in train stations.
We live in a bubble, essentially.
Yeah, at the dinner table, like everywhere there's some source of external stimulation that is there and distracting you from actual focus on either the person you're talking to or the activity you're engaged in. Like people even watch TV in bed, which is one of the worst things you can do. So that's just one example. And of course, the internet takes that to the max. So building a second brain is basically a first principles and empirically supported approach to structuring the way that you consume information, process it, and then feed it into output of information. And so especially people like you, people like people who are knowledge workers, people who are not necessarily working with physical processes, who are more engaged in organizing things, managing things, producing content, producing output, they're the prime audience for this approach because they're constantly on a daily basis dealing with information. And so I'm sure virtually everybody who's listening to this, you and I included, will have had days that went by where you start off the day full of hope for achieving your goals, and you end it with like half a goal done and like the rest sort of not done because you found some interesting article and it took you down this really interesting rabbit hole. I certainly know that I do this on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's so common for that to happen though, because if you think about it, at least for me, if I'm working all day, I have access to the internet, I have access to my phone. If you have a TV running that's broadcasting the news or a TV show, if you have a book next to you and you decide to read that, we have so many distractions that it creates a running task list of more things to do. Oh, I have to watch this video. I have to read this article. Oh, I have to message this person back. And I think it's really just information overload, this, that, the other, that it really just causes more stress because we're not being able to just focus on what is immediately at hand and what we need to accomplish right here, right now. So the next day we look back and we have a huge list of things to do, and we haven't even completed what we had to do the day before.
Right. And so what you just described is like the stuff that stays open that you're not finishing, we could call open loops. And this is terminology that comes from getting things done. And it's this idea that things that are awarenesses that you have that you might want to do, will have to do at some point, etc. Anything where you are not currently capable of finishing it in this moment is an open loop that runs in your brain. And so an open loop that runs in your brain, even if it's just in the background, even if it's just something you had like 4 months ago that you wanted to do, unless you sort of internally, psychologically close it, finish it, tie it up, it's open and it's consuming RAM, it's consuming working memory, it's consuming processing power of your brain. And so you literally get slower because you're opening and opening and opening all these loops, but you're never closing them. And so as these open loops exist there, you're not going to be able to finish them. You're not going to continuously fail to close them and open new ones on top of that. And so it's just it's sort of like, do you remember still the time when you had to defrag your computer?
Yep, I remember those days. I mean, if you have too much data on your hard drive and you have no idea what to do, I mean, that's the only way, really, or you delete a lot of useful information, or at least information that you perceive to be useful on your hard drive. And I'm sure myself, as well as most people out there, have a bad habit of just storing way too much information on our devices that we just never go back to. And I think that's one of the things that the second brain really touches on, along with its framework.
Right. So how do you organize your task list? Like, what's your method, if you have any?
So the irony is, I was reading the other day about the second brain workshop, and he goes in and talks about how people use OneNote or Evernote or a notepad to just organize their information in such a way. And I actually use Microsoft OneNote every single day. I'm using it right now as I'm talking to you. I have a huge list of questions and topics to cover, and while I'm working, I use OneNote broken down into different topics with different subtopics, whether it be meetings or different tasks to do or different just general pieces of information. But the problem with that, Moritz, is that information could become overflowing. So typically you would want all your information to be stored in one specific area so you can just go and easily find it. But in this case, when you have different folders and different subfolders across a bunch of different platforms, for example, And this is notwithstanding the fact that I use Reddit or that I use YouTube to store information or my favorites bar on my internet. It's that we have so much data that is stored across a multitude of platforms, and it becomes extremely difficult to manage and to locate that information when we need it. So if I save something today, I might forget to come back to it 6 months from now. And I have a habit of doing that with Reddit. I'll save things, and then 6 months later, I'll realize, oh, I saved that, but I never utilize it. So we're storing information that doesn't accrue any value for us. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes. Or rather, it does hold value, but sometimes the cost of finding it actually outperforms the value that it could probably bring to you. I mean, a lot of the value of ideas lies in their connection to each other. And so one of the things that a central place for storing information brings with it is this sort of serendipitous discovery of relationships between information, between nodes, between artifacts that you've saved. And so a lot of insights can come from that. But if you have your saved list in Reddit, your favorites in Facebook, your liked tweets, etc., they're all in their own spots and they're not in one place. And so when you want to connect something that's here with something that's there, you have to find each of these. And by the time that you found them, you're sort of already, the inspiration has passed over you. So
what has been what has been your experience based off this workshop in reassessing and adapting to a new way of thinking and organizing information? Because like you said, there's different areas that we store this information. So what is the solution really to becoming better at organizing this information so we could become more productive?
Right. So I'll preface this with a sort of not trigger warning, but like a content label. Let's say, like, I don't think that this or any other approach is sort of a end all be all or like a holy gospel. Like, it's a tool, it's a mindset, it's a way of doing things, and I regularly do this more or less. So, for example, the past 6 to 7 months, I haven't used my second brain virtually at all. So, and I tend to go back and forth between these. I mean, this is partially because of a personal sort of depressive period that I had again, and I had to sort of recenter, and that also involved getting away from digital distractions and away from all this other stuff. So, but in general, I think of these things as extensions of myself, and sometimes the actual self that these things are extended from takes priority. And so, but the way that you start off building a second brain, and the way that you, let's say, get going is you take stock. Like, it's sort of this, the first thing is you look, what are your actual habits? There's a huge checklist that he has, and actual action items that he asks you to go through when you first take the course. And it includes stuff like gather all your to-do items, like wherever they are, if they're a notebook, if they're on your email, if they're like on your mind, just write it all down, write it all out as much as you can in one session. And then get yourself a task manager of some sort. There are plenty out there, Todoist things. Evernote can also serve that if you want to, although it's actually not organized for that. There are plenty of options out there, and keep all your action items in one place. Then, for example, do a review of what are your email habits? Do you let email just accumulate? Is it all in one place? Is it all like staying in the inbox? Are you archiving? Are you deleting anything? So there's all these different parts of it, all of these parts of our online lives that are just unconscious habits that we've grown into, not because we are lazy people, but because these tools make it so very easy to operate in that way, right? Like, there's no real guardrails or structures built into these. Sometimes exactly the opposite. That would help you make use of them in a mindful and productive way. I mean, I just started using a new email tool by Basecamp called Hey. where they've basically re-architected the entire experience of email to be conducive to mindful engagement with email, and solve these problems that we have of like stuff not being able to find stuff, or having people spam your inbox and you can't really mute them, and all these other problems. So the tools we have, that's something that you have to understand, are often built in a way that they actually maximize your emotional triggers and the time spent attending to them, rather than actually serving your own purposes. Facebook, as all these social media ones are.
Can you elaborate on what you just mentioned about focusing on the emotional triggers of people? What do you mean exactly?
So nearly everybody today, especially the younger generation, of course, uses social media. I mean, my generation started with sort of Facebook. I think the earlier end of us actually still did MySpace.
MySpace, yep.
Yes, exactly. I didn't really get into that. I was sort of on the bell end of that. And then people move on to Twitter, and now today the sort of hot ones are still somewhat Instagram and Snapchat, although actually much more TikTok now. And so if you sort of put those on a path of or a spectrum, you see that the emergence of these moves progressively from more text-based and sort of slow to more visual stimulation, and fast and quick and short. And so as people move into social media from the old analog media, or the older non-social media, the triggers required to get them to use the site and to watch advertising, because that's the business model of these platforms. You're the product, and you're paying with your attention to advertisement to get this so-called free service of being able to see your friends' pictures. That their incentive and their actual architectures are geared towards maximizing the time that you spend on the site so that you can see more ads, and to arouse you emotionally as much as possible, be that positively or negatively, and negative emotion is often stronger than positive emotion, or more easily incited, that the algorithms optimize to do that. And so that's also why I have identified platforms like Facebook as real drivers of political movements, of hateful trends, even of suicide epidemics among teenage girls that are incapable of regulating their own emotion in response to social shaming or cyberbullying that makes them commit suicide, because they're not able to separate the digital and the real world, or they actually are going through a sort of social death where somebody publishes revenge porn or says bad things about them on some public forum, that they can't deal with the emotional rush that brings them, and they actually commit suicide. And so there are real problems that we don't realize. Just to give you a strong mental image of how weighted the scales are against your favor, Facebook, Amazon, Google, YouTube, etc., all of these companies are dedicating millions and millions of dollars a year to cutting-edge psychological research at the top institutions and universities in the world, to research and find out and operationalize the triggers and the structures at play in your mind and in your environment that just influence you. And so you're just this schmuck on a platform where you don't even realize how it works, and you're thinking that you're using it in a way that like helps you. And I think people have this general sense that they're getting exhausted from these things, but they don't really know what to do about it. And so building a second brain, this is a comprehensive approach to diagnosing that problem among others, and then building a systematic way to separate the stages of information processing into capture, processing, and output or creation. And so when you have those three stages, and when you have tools and processes for each of these, you can then switch between them and make use of each as your goals require and your intentions want, rather than what the incentives and interests of Mark Zuckerberg's bank account are.
That is very fascinating, and I've heard this theory and idea multiple times. I mean, it's more realism than theory and practicality, but the idea that social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram promote this sort of dopamine spike or rush into the individual by utilizing things like buttons or different emojis or even Reddit with upvotes. They basically target the individual's self-worth by connecting that to the idea of how many likes they get, how many upvotes they get, how many comments they get. So it really just results in sort of an addiction to these platforms. So what I'm gathering from what the second brain does, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it reorganizes or helps you reorganize how you store information in such a way that you're taking control over your data, as opposed to letting someone else influence how you use your information. So you only use certain platforms to pull specific pieces of information and storing that on your OneNote or your Evernote or whatever it may be, as opposed to being distracted by Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook or whatever it may be, and being focused on the advertisements and media that they're pushing to you. You're taking control of that and pulling what it is that you need for yourself.
Right.
Would you say that's kind of a correct interpretation of this?
Yes. And I would say tying it to practical pursuits. Like people, like we all have some goals, probably, like even if it's just very simple things like make more money or have a good relationship with your spouse or those kind of things, or maybe more ambitious goals like, I don't know, build a company or create a service or change the world, quote unquote. So if you have some goals, then you would want to ideally, and this, I mean, it's not necessarily given, but you would want to probably arrange your life to facilitate your meeting of those goals. And so part of your life is all the time and attention you spend on these platforms, you spend in the digital arena. And so knowing how to structure your engagement with them in a way that allows you to move closer to your goals is a strong part in your success. So that's what the pitch sort of is, yes.
And there is one more underlying aspect of the second brain that I really like that stood out about it. And that is that it allows you to organize your notes and information in such a way that you're able to focus on creativity. You don't get so absorbed in the information where it is. You have it where you need it. But the true underlying benefit of it is that the way you organize the information creates sort of a web of different connections between different ideas. Like you have a website connected to an article, connected to a book, connected to a podcast, all on that specific way of structuring your notes, that you can focus strictly on creativity and come back to that notepad for inspiration on whatever product you're building or whatever creative endeavor you're pursuing. So I personally find it to be really interesting in that sense, because it is a driver of inspiration more so than anything else, in my opinion.
Yes, you really latched onto one of the key insights here, and one of the most freeing things for me too, which is I have, like many people, this gathering instinct, right? Like we humans are natural accumulators of stuff, of things, of ideas. We want to acquire
naturally
things.
Hoarding things.
Yes, exactly. Opportunities in all their forms. And so But what we often don't realize is that the more stuff we have, the more the stuff has us too. So when you own a lot, you're committed to a lifestyle that includes all those things too. So one of the things that I, for example, credit with my personal sense of freedom is not actually owning a lot of stuff that would keep me tied to a particular way of living my life. I'm pretty flexible. Now, I do want to actually settle down at some point and sort of have more stable arrangements.
That sounds almost like a nomadic lifestyle.
Yeah, I am moving away from that more and more. I never really intended to end up this way, but it just naturally evolved because I was involved with so many different people and groups and projects that I just ended up meeting them wherever they are, and that ended up being global. But yeah, the sense of freedom that comes from having everything in one place means that you can also just have it there, but not actually do anything with it when you don't want to. Like, so, for example, for me, I love to read all these interesting posts on Facebook, because also actually I've tuned my social media to upregulate information that is interesting and stimulating in all the right ways, and downregulate information and people and posts that are not really interesting to me. And so I just constantly prune and extend my network in that way. And so when I save something from there, it goes into my Evernote, but I don't need to necessarily do something with it. I just know it's there, and so that desire is satisfied. I've saved it. It is there if I need it, but most likely I will actually never need it again. And so saving stuff gives you that psychological freedom, first and foremost, of knowing if I need it, it is there. But because it is there, I can now focus on other things. And so you're moving on more quickly from stuff that would otherwise keep your attention captured, because you're saying, oh, like, this is so cool. I want to like stay, like, hold on to it, but you don't know how to safely save it in some sense.
Right. So it doesn't force you to utilize that information right at that moment. You're able to kind of just put it away, and at a later time, if you have the need for it, if you're working for something and you realize, oh, wait, I have this note somewhere, you go into your Evernote and it's right there, and you can use that as sort of inspiration or as a guide to help you complete whatever it is that you're working on, essentially.
Right. And crucially, you can search. It's so basic, but it's so powerful. Like, you can search your entire database with one query and find whatever it is that you're looking for. You can't do that with a paper notebook. You can't do that with whatever other tools that you use that are analog. So when you have digital tools and you have one place where you save all the most interesting stuff, you can find everything that you need.
I think a lot of these concepts are driving into a direction that I want to touch on, and that is, you took the idea of the second brain and you sort of elevated it in different directions by moving into a first, second, third, fourth brain and body, and then simplified it into something that you call the extended man, but also tied that into the philosophical idea of human agency. And at this point, I have probably confused many listeners out there with these two terms. So I want to pause for a moment to allow you to explain, first off, what the extended man is, what human agency is, and how you took those two pieces to elevate what the second brain concept was.
I'll try and keep it very simple, but you'll have to interrupt me if I don't keep it brief. So Tiago's idea with the second brain was, okay, you have your regular brain, and your regular brain is great at a lot of things. It is great at creativity. It's great at associating things. It's great with coming up ideas. But it's not that great at storing information in all its forms, and it's not that great at recalling information. Actually, when you recall a memory, you are going to change it every time you access it. So actually memories are these living things rather than sort of a data thing that you're storing in full fidelity. And so the second brain allows you to take all that stuff that you can't store in your first brain and put it into the second brain so that it does the things best that you do worst, which is to store and access information in the state that you found it. And so that's great, but it's not necessarily enough. Like it gives you a whole lot of superpowers, but there's another stage that I would call the third brain, which actually maps nicely to a different online course that Thiago built together with another podcaster, David Perel, that they called Rite of Passage. Write with WR. So it's all about basically writing online. And so what Rite of Passage talks about and what the third brain is about is taking those superpowers you now have and turning them towards output in a social fashion. So when you write online, you start to build up a portfolio and a body of work that is accessible by virtually anybody without you having to individually attend to people trying to learn from you. So you can just share stuff and people can access it whenever they want to. And so when you have that, people start to come to you for ideas, for inspiration, for value, for whatever it may be. And so you start to build a network of people that you're in communication with, sometimes more broadcasting, sometimes more peer-to-peer direct interaction. And that opens up a whole world of opportunities, because as you become somebody who puts out ideas and value in whatever form it takes, be that podcasts, books, articles, whatever, posts even, people start to associate you with interesting things. And I have this phenomenon happen constantly that whenever I post a lot of stuff on Facebook, because that's my primary platform, and people associate my name on that platform in my network with a very weird collection of all kinds of different subjects, different ways of thinking about things, etc. And so when they see something weird, they think, oh, Moritz wants to see that, and they send it to me. And so what I've done now is I've extended my perception, my eyes, my ears, all of the senses that allow me to take information through other people, socially, and with the help of the internet, into the whole world. And so now they are a part of my network of perception in some sense. And so that's what the third brain is. The third brain is the social component that emerges once you start to put your second brain to work and put out information rather than just consume. So it's the stage after output. And so now you mentioned one more stage there. And so I took that and extended it even one more step further, which is the fourth brain. The fourth brain is, so you now have your second brain where you store information. You have your third brain where you have extended your perception and your opportunity generation to other people. And now you have the fourth brain where you take that network or a subset of that network and you turn it towards the achievement of a specific focus. And so that's what I would call, to take Elon Musk's term, a cybernetic collective that has a particular goal. So for example, Tesla has the goal of making electric vehicles affordable, which is just actually a sub-goal of Elon Musk's greater vision of actual energy sustainability on Earth, and then of course also reaching Mars as a backup. And he has all these massive, massive goals out there, and he turns both the people who work at his companies, as well as the people that are fans of his vision, toward the attainment of those goals by inspiring them constantly with beautiful ideas and events where he gathers attention to particular advancements, etc. And so the fourth brain is all about achieving something, achieving a goal with other people that are also operating in this way.
Mm-hmm. And
And
kind of
so,
what's fascinating about that, sorry to interrupt, but what's kind of
good.
fascinating about that Elon Musk example is that his ideas, to your point, are all extremely tied together under that fourth brain idea. Because,
Yes.
like you said, you take those specific networks of yours and you turn them towards a specific goal or specific subset of goals that all unify under one larger goal. So if his large goal is to get to Mars, then by utilizing Tesla and his other ventures, those are ultimately empowering his greater goal of habitability on the planet Mars, because eventually
Right.
you could see electric vehicles on Mars. You could use his, I forgot the name of it, but he has a satellite
Starlink.
company. Yeah, that Starlink. You could see Starlink be utilized on the planet Mars. I mean, there's so many different smaller companies that really roll up into one larger unifying goal based off what you're saying.
Right. I actually saw Starlink, a series of Starlink satellites just yesterday night cross the starry sky in Portugal here. Was amazing to
That
see.
is
Like,
crazy. Are
yes,
they
like they're
are they
just
really
shooting by.
visible?
Yeah, they were really visible. You just a long line, sort of a pearl pearl necklace of stars shooting across the sky, like in like spaced out segments, was amazing. Um,
What I find crazy is if there's so many satellites out in space, how come they're able to put them in orbit in such a way that none of them ever collide with one another? Like I could,
I wonder that too.
yeah. There's just way too many out there in space. But hey, I mean, if they can make it work, they can make it work. So,
Right, that's a huge problem. But yeah, so yeah, you're right. Like Starlink, Tesla, all of these companies are gears of a greater vision. And so what Elon Musk is doing is he's pulling together different horizontals or different verticals into a sort of second level of horizontal. So he's making each of these their own pillar that can stand on their own, can be profitable on their own, but that can also support each other uh, in very unexpected ways. Like the battery, for example, that was first built for the Tesla vehicles, then ended up laying the foundation for home batteries that can make
mm-hmm.
homes be more energy independent from the grid, and then producing tiles that are able to generate electricity from sun. And then sometimes he'll actually take money from one company and pour into the other one. That one's currently struggling. And then some key development in one company drives the development of something in the other. So he's basically seeing them all as this large web of interrelated pursuits that are geared towards one or two big visions. And so he's making use also of what Tiago calls this portfolio approach, which you as an individual can also take. So I think you're doing that too. You're doing podcasts, and I assume you're also publishing information in some other form, probably on a blog or a new
Mm-hmm.
website, and also on social media. And you're probably doing that as a preparation for, also simultaneously parallel to other things that are sort of supporting that. And Scott Adams actually calls this approach the skill stack. And so sometimes
Mm-hmm.
you, like when you're, especially when you're not building a career that's following a pretty clearly predefined track, like for example a doctor going to medical school and then going to the hospital, what you can do alternatively is take a look at the skills you already have and then add another skill to it that may not be related but that supports or and can support the other ones. So for example, Scott Adams liked to draw, and so he added then podcasting, or rather like video casting to it, and then speaking, and then all these other things. And so now he has this media empire that drives national conversation about political topics and other things, and from a simple combination of different skills, but that all support each other.
It's funny. I know Naval Ravikant, a very famous
Mm-hmm.
investor, of tech startups, he has a very similar mindset when it comes to gathering skills.
Right.
He proposes the idea that rather than specializing in one specific area and hoping that you're able to keep up with the constant advancements and changes in that industry. So, for example, if you go into coding or if you become a doctor, you have to constantly keep up with the changes in those industries and keep
Yes.
learning. Whereas a better approach might be to become a generalist. So, not basically a master of none, but
Right.
someone who knows a little bit about every single topic, because at some point you might be able to take those different perspectives of the knowledge you do have and make more informed and valuable decisions, whether it be investing
Right.
or whether it be starting a company. It's better to do that than it is to just become hyper focused on one specific
Right.
expertise.
Right.
And I think a lot more people are kind of taking that approach these days because
Yes.
there's so much access to information that you could just learn different things. You're not stuck learning a single thing. So, for example,
Yes.
with my podcast, I can learn how to market and I can learn how to build a website. And then I also, on top of that, can blog. I can communicate with people. I can build my network. There's so many different sub layers that might not exactly be hyper focused with podcasting, but they add a little bit of value and allow me to branch off and do different things on top of that.
Right. It's more like it's like an assemblage approach. You do a bunch of different things, but they all interweave with each other. And there are different people who call this different things. For example, David Perel, the mind behind the Rite of Passage course, he calls this your personal monopoly. So if
Mm.
you are the only one that does the thing that you do or the things that you do together, then you have a personal monopoly that nobody can take away from you because you are building your own niche. Um, and so also you could call it like if there are if there are masters of none, which
Mm-hmm.
are generalists, and there are masters of one, which are specialists, there are also people who master themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they become their own thing, and they're not subject as much to the larger forces that force people into a particular niche or up a certain trajectory, but they force, not necessarily by force, but they force others to change themselves to fit them because they are so compelling along whatever dimension it may be. And so I think that's a good frame to have in mind when you think about building a career. But as we spoke about earlier, when you're building a business, you are the bottleneck in the growth of that business. And so the not like learning how to deal with information is one thing, and it's absolutely key, especially in this networked, highly stimulating world that we're in today. But another part that also supports that is your body. It's being able to, for example, pay attention to your heart rate or your breathing, or meditating, or knowing how to move graciously, or playing a sport, or having social relationships that are active rather than sort of this passive or intellectual. And so, what I did to come back to what we were starting this rabbit hole out with was this concept. Okay, first, second, third, fourth, brain. Yes, we covered that. But now think about the same thing in terms of the body, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. First body is pretty obvious. We all have our own body. But then second body would be the tools that you use to extend your capacities in time and space. So, of course, the internet is one of those, the computer is another. But if you sort of think about this more in terms of activity or body, then it would be in a sport, for example, the tennis racket you use to smash the ball over the net, or your shoes that you'd wear every day that actually are like little casts that form your foot into this weird shape that
Mm-hmm.
is not natural. Um, so there are all these things that we use and that humans have been using forever since we were humans, because that's part of what makes us human, tools that extend our capacity to interact with the environment in key ways. And so the third body then would be extending yourself through other people. So hunting with other people, you're forming a group or playing a sport, for example. Well, actually, third body would still be just being in a community of people, but not necessarily having a shared goal. But then fourth body would be being part of some kind of group that is achieving some physical goal. For example, an army where each soldier is part of the group process trying to defend a territory or capture another and keep each other safe and capture other people or kill other people. To resort to martial metaphors, so of course, a sport is a much safer example of that. And so I took those two, because what I did there is I extended the second brain 2 more levels upwards. Then I added this dimension of the body, which also has all those 4 stages. And so then I simplified it, as you said, to the extended man to give a sort of general concept to this system of ideas of having yourself and your bodily and mental functions extended through time and space with the help of tools and people to achieve basic biological functions like feeding yourself, but then also all kinds of other goals like, I don't know, becoming spiritually enlightened or having a family or building a house, whatever it may be, that is the thing that you want to set your mind to. And so that's what this extended man idea is. And what it really has to do with human agency is that when you become capable in operating not only your first brain and body, your first brain and body, as in knowing how to operate this space monkey suit that your soul is housed in, but you extend your capacity toward all these other layers that I just mentioned, you become a powerful person, not just in the sense of power over others, but in the sense of knowing how to act right, virtuously as well as with capacity. And so you will be able, and this is what human agency means, you will be able to anticipate the consequences of your action and choose and act in a way that accomplishes your goals. And that's what agency means.
That is a lot of information to kind of absorb and deconstruct. But I would like to kind of point real quick to an example that we talked to before our show today. And I think either you told me it or I saw it somewhere. But the idea was that if you're sitting in a room by yourself trying to solve a computer science problem, for example, you have everything in your room around you that is consisting of a second, third, or fourth brain because they contain information and data that you store that pertain to your personal identity, to your thoughts, to your interests. So when you're in a situation trying to solve that problem, you become bottlenecked because you don't have access to the concepts of how to solve it. So although you may be able to solve that problem, it might take you a bit longer to do so. Whereas if we use the concept that you kind of described here by taking it in different directions, by extending through the second, third, and fourth body of man, then you can reach out to a friend. You can reach out to somebody in the community and invite them over or go over to somewhere mutual where you can sit down and have them explain to you their thought process or how they work through that problem. And not only are you enabling yourself to be more productive in that manner by solving the problem faster, but at a deeper level, you're building that human connection. It becomes mutually beneficial for not only you, but the other individual and building a relationship. And even on top of that, you have the feeling of which that person can come to you for help if they need a favor or if they need to collaborate with you. So if I'm understanding this right, you're taking the idea of having an external database of information and you're using community to extend your ability to process information towards specific goals.
I like to think of it, the specific thing that you just discussed is, yes, of course, you're making use of, well, it sounds so utilitarian, but you're making use of somebody else's unique perspective that you, of course, you yourself don't hold because you're you, to augment your capacity to look at a problem and to solve it. So that was the basic example. But what you're also doing is when you're inviting somebody into your life, let's say, you're building that human connection, as you said. And by having that connection, you build up trust. And what trust means is that you each invest into the relationship and you stand to gain opportunities from that in the future. So a relationship is really the opening up of a channel that information, value, resources can flow across. So when I invite you into my life and I explain to you this problem that I'm working on and you help me, now not only have I solved this problem perhaps, but also you've now shown that you are a good friend to me. You're able to actually help me solve these things. So I will come to you in the future with these things again. And not only that, I might also now keep out an eye, for example, for a job because I know you're looking for something and you're not finding it yet. So I'll keep my eyes peeled for something that you need right now. So really, trust and this human connection that you spoke to is a crucial feature, especially in a networked world, of extending ourselves into other people so that we gain access to things we would not otherwise be able to get access to. Yeah, definitely. So it's sort of like placing a listener.
I love that explanation, and I liken it to the example you provided earlier in regards to Facebook. I saw one of your posts on there in regards to the indexing strategy, and I'm sure we can talk about that right after this. But I liken it to the way you post on Facebook because you use that as a way to represent how people will search your name on there and they will notice your connections to different topics that go down different paths. And from that, they use that as a means to provide you information that is similar to the things that you enjoy doing. So ultimately, it's building this interconnected web of trust and relationships and community to become sort of not a self-serving, but a self-functioning flow of information across a community of individuals. Because people in that community might all find interest in certain pieces of information. So if you're able to network with all of these people and build these layers of trust, people are more likely to share with you ideas or concepts or thoughts or any form of information that you might find useful. And vis-a-vis, you might do the same for them or for another individual in your network. So you're really, in essence, amplifying and empowering each other to reach your goals separately and collectively.
Right. You're essentially doing a less high fidelity form of community building in a sense, if you're doing it right. I mean, of course, you can also do it. You can also use this conceptual framework to assist you in becoming powerful in these respects, but then turn that towards other goals. Like people do use this kind of information to win in political conflicts or to build a business where they actually exploit other people. So as always, technology and knowledge is power, and power corrupts. So there's always the danger of people taking it and turning it into something that is purely extractive. But what it does make possible is extending those relationships with the use of technology, rather than having technology be the thing that drives the way that you act.
And I know I touched real quick on the idea of indexing strategy, and I had the chance to briefly go over it. The topic was the indexing strategy in network systems, and it was a very broken out process of, how I would put it, is a method for managing information flow. And I wasn't sure if there were any parallels between that idea and concept and the one of the second brain, but I felt it would be interesting to bring up this topic that you wrote on and kind of get your impression or summary of what it is exactly.
Yes, so what I just described with building up this network directly leads into this, because once you become somebody that shares ideas consistently and that is seen as somebody who has access to them, produces them, and processes them, then people start to pay attention to you. And that position of a central node to a network also comes with a certain responsibility. And so as you become adept at using these strategies, then it also becomes quite crucial to learn how to deploy them in a, let's say, socially agreeable way, and in a responsible way as well. So one way of doing that, for example, is prefacing opinions that you have online with, like the rationality community does, epistemic statements like, I am like 50% sure of this, and I arrived at this conclusion by this process, right? It's a very weird and like sort of roundabout way it feels, but it's a way to hedge and to qualify what you say so that it can't be as easily misunderstood and misconstrued. So that's great, right?
I see.
Because information, once it's out there, it is on its own. Like, yes, you can change the post, but it's out there, and other versions of it, the previous versions of it exist. You can't easily scrub it from the world. So by making information carry its own disclaimer, let's say, you're reducing the potential for damaging ambiguity. So that's one thing, and I'm bringing that up because that's one strategy of using information in a specific way that achieves a certain goal that people don't necessarily even realize that they're engaging in when they post on Facebook without those kind of strategies. And so the indexing strategy, on the other hand, is a sort of comprehensive strategy to take information that exists in disparate places and then bring it into some kind of shared world. And the examples I listed on there, and the examples I think are most prescient are things like Wikipedia, for example. Wikipedia, what does Wikipedia do? It basically makes this claim that there is this whole wide world of knowledge out there, and we can categorize it. Like we can capture it. We can make it navigatable. And Google does the same thing as well, except it is more focused on search and sort of just making references to other people's contents rather than to a single version of the content on each topic as Wikipedia does. But what they're doing there is they're indexing information. That means index, the word, literally comes from indices, which means to point. So when you're indexing something, you're pointing towards something. That's what humans do all the time. We always point. We're extremely social and spatial. And so when we point to something, we are directing attention. And that's really the superpower in our era. It's to direct attention, both your own and that of others. And so indexing means you generating, gathering, and displaying information on one platform or multiple in a way that builds a sort of extremely interwoven lattice work of different types of content that form a strong mesh that people find connections from one to the other, multiple places, and that starts to capture attention in that web, in that mesh. So Google has people coming back to it again and again and again and again because they have this strong expectation that is fulfilled every time, or nearly every time, that when they go to Google and they search for something, they will find something relevant. And so the same thing, the same psychological phenomenon we can ourselves make use of if we gather this, have all this gathered information, and then go about making it available to other people, but augmented through our own commentary or through our own way of displaying it or through our own process of sharing it. And so when I post on Facebook or on Twitter or on other platforms, I, for example, have various motives with that, but one of them is to constantly gauge what other people think about things and how they approach them. And so often I will share things that either sound dumb or one-sided or unthoughtful or all kinds of other manner of sort of motivated or of different kinds of qualities, and then see how people respond. Like, do they understand that I'm playing a game with this? Do they think I'm playing a game with this while I'm actually not? And so there is a sort of partially Machiavellian quality to it, in that I'm constantly sort of poking people, and I'm not doing that to like necessarily make them uncomfortable or to hurt them, because I'm actually not hurting them most of the time at all. It's more a pushing against limits, pushing against boundaries to reveal the actual underlying invisible threat, let's say. Because I can only know the world by acting, and that is feeling the response. And so, through that, I challenge the people around me, and I don't only confirm their biases. And then where the people have too strong biases, they will jump into one way of viewing this thing and not let loose of it. And so I know now what I can talk to this person, what I can't talk to this person about, and how I have to adjust my relationship with them. So that's one way that I'm doing it. And the indexing strategy is this generalized strategy that I've formulated as a way to conceptually unite all of these services, platforms, and phenomena, like even the Bible, that do something. They gather stuff in one place. They create what's called an ontology, basically a way of viewing the world and categorizing things within it, and then displaying it and the relationships between those things to the reader. And that forms a powerful nexus of ideas that attracts people, keeps their attention, and sometimes converts them to a cause even.
Wow. That is a really interesting way of strategically managing information flow. I think one of the things that I'm kind of confused on here, though, if I may,
please,
is that prior to the indexing strategy, you mentioned that when posting on social media, it's best to kind of follow sort of a rule of thumb where you say, I'm 50% sure about something, and here is my reasoning for that. Whereas under the indexing strategy, and I may be conflating things here, but under the indexing strategy, you kind of talk about the idea of pushing buttons and posting sort of biases or posts that might incite some sort of conflict just to pull out the underlying beliefs or thoughts from your readers, which will ultimately determine how to communicate with them further. So I guess what I'm trying to understand here is, how do you rationalize, or how do you go about processing, communicating with 50% certainty to posting information in such a way that it's pushing buttons, so to speak?
Well, these two things are sort of they're modes that you can engage in, right? And they're separate things. So I could be just doing the one thing of like making disclaimers in front of my post and saying this is like only I'm very unsure of this, but I want to share it anyway. So deal with it accordingly. Don't take it as truth. That would be one way of doing it, and it can very well be used as part of the indexing strategy too. Like when you're because the indexing strategy just says that just tells you that it's valuable to provide a whole world of relationships and categories for the information that you're sharing so that people can intelligibly interact with it. That's pretty much what it's all about. And so part of like the disclaimer thing can be part of that. But then there's this other phenomenon of my personal way of dealing with my posting of my communication is to not sort of speak to my my network as a broadcaster to an audience, but as somebody who is in a relationship with them. And when I'm in a relationship with somebody, I don't want them to either take my word as gospel or like distrust every single thing I say, right? Like, either one of those isn't really a relationship. It's either hero worship or enemy. So I'm trying to play in the gray or the middle space of that by constantly moving more to one and then back to the other side to tease out, to feel out where people are harboring uncertainty, where they're unaware of their own biases, where they are displaying ignorance, where they are extremely knowledgeable. And I can only hit upon those veins of gold, if you will, if I dive into the mountain of shit, to be frank. And so it's sort of a sewer rat approach. Like there's all kinds of interesting things out there in this toxic slough of information, but you can only access it if you dive in and you have your hazmat gear on and know how to operate it. So by pushing against the wall, by poking at people, I'm asking them to like either show that they are aware of how to responsibly deal with information or not, and then I can adjust whether I share with this particular person this particular thing again, or whether I have to maybe poke at them into this other direction because I think they're actually too extreme right now, and they're hurting themselves and others when they're like engaging in some kind of political LARPing because they have a deep unsatisfied human need underneath it that they're masking by like becoming part of an online group. So, and this maybe is a bit confusing because we haven't really talked about like what it is that I do and what I care about, other than sort of the community building that I talked about and sort of being self-reliant, yes. But my sort of my modus operandi is really all about understanding the world as much as I can and helping the people that I come in touch with, let's say, access deeper levels or realize deeper intentions than the surface level ones that they tend to profess to believe, but that they have never even actually examined themselves. So there's different directions we can go here, but that's really sort of what I care about, and it's best captured in this phrase that actually came to me in a dynamic meditation that I did, where I was exercising my body, where this phrase popped into my head that said, "I am a meta missionary. I convert people to their own cause." And so that's so this two sentence phrase that really captures the essence of what I try to do, which is to understand myself and others better, and then to not convert them to my cause, but convert them to their cause. And that's this idea of the meta missionary.
I will have to say, first off, that the way you describe this, at least the process or framework by which you kind of gather sublying information from people requires a lot of self-awareness, if you will, because it requires somebody to dig deeper than the surface when it comes to communicating with people. If you're on any form of social media, or if you're communicating with people on a platform in which you don't necessarily see that person visibly, they're more likely to express certain opinions. It's not until you kind of poke at that and attempt to pull out the truth or their underlying motives or insecurities or thoughts and feelings that you'll kind of understand where they're coming from. So I think what I'm understanding here or gathering is that your process is to help people, empower people, and to enable people to be their best versions of themselves by really just, pardon my French, but by cutting through the bullshit and by really just digging deeper than the surface level, by really understanding who they are. And I really love the term you used of being a meta missionary to help convert people to their own cause. You're digging out their underlying beliefs to help them really just turn their focus to that, as opposed to covering it up with a bunch of gibberish or thoughts that don't necessarily align with what they're really deeply thinking. So I think that's a really kind of beautiful sort of way to express what it is that you really do and what your desire is as an individual. Because don't get me wrong, a lot of the information that we talked about when it comes to the second brain, to indexing, to community, I think these are all very, very interesting and powerful pieces of information and types of work you do. But I think they also drive a lot of what your deeper interests and desires are when it comes to helping people. They are kind of the tools and enablers for doing that work that you do. And I think that's incredibly admirable that you kind of possess a lot of this self-awareness and choose to focus it or channel it in such a way to help people. I think it's amazing, honestly.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the strange thing is, like, the path or the way that I frame it now is language and ideas that I've acquired and developed over the past couple of years. But at the time that I was experiencing each of these individually, I didn't have necessarily like the clear idea in mind of, like, hey, this is what I want to achieve, or this is what I'm doing. It's only after the fact that I always realized what the underlying driver was. And I basically poked myself enough that something gave way, and I realized, oh, this is actually what is behind that. And I think it is a truly open-ended question whether something like online community is even a meaningful word. Like, is it possible to have strong, real relationships primarily over the internet? I don't know that the answer is yes, but I want to find out. And so what I'm doing with these different things is poking at that and seeing whether it makes sense, whether it comes together.
I personally think that online communities can have sort of a power to them and incite connections and trust between people. And I think what the basis of that really is the underlying goals or interests those people have. So if you look at the video game community, people might have an underlying interest in certain video games, or the film industry, people might have certain interests in certain type of films, or even with novels, and there's that connection. And if you look even outside of technology, what is the main driving force for relationships or personal connections? It might be shared interests, it might be religion, it might be culture, it might be geographic location, it might be race, religion, as I've mentioned, color, anything. It could be any sort of connection. And I think those parallels do exist, Moritz, between real life and technologies that contain social media. I think there's that parallel between that. So I do think people can really build strong centric communities on the internet. Now, if that can scale is another question, because we don't necessarily know the underlying beliefs or opinions or thoughts of individuals online, unless, like you said, you kind of pry it out from them. And that takes a lot of work. It's not an easy process.
Right.
But once you really... Yeah, go ahead.
And not only that, on the internet, you have the problem of scale, exactly, and of technological extension of the agency of very few people over very large numbers of people. So when we use these tools that connect us, like Facebook, like Twitter, all of these other tools, we are operating within the castle of the few people that build these platforms and that make the rules for these platforms and also enforce these rules. And so, and that also the people that within those castles, or within those territories, digital territories, let's say, use psychological warfare to fulfill their own ends, be those political or economic or otherwise. And so what I'm also doing with this kind of process, or just what I'm doing, is to try and not just educate, but to train people in operating themselves in a way that makes them less likely to fall prey to external manipulation by actors who don't have their best interests at heart, and to become forces for the good that they uniquely can bring to the world by understanding the dynamics at play in this arena and acting well within them. And so that requires all those parts that we went through of the body, the mind, and of the tools that we use and the people that we gather around ourselves. And so really, because nearly nobody understands this on a deep embodied level, maybe some people on an intellectual level, but very few people practice this in their day-to-day life, of understanding how much other actors, by using technology that is cheap, fast, and extremely effective at manipulating us with these algorithms, can put entire nations on their knees by simple information warfare. And so when nations can be brought to their knees with simple viral campaigns, think about what that means for the individual. And so I think it's key that we have people become better at opening themselves to the right kinds of stuff and clothing themselves off and recognizing when a virus or other kinds of entries or bad things trying to enter your digital body or mind.
I 100% agree with that. And I think a lot of the frameworks that we talked about earlier, like you said, really help people become more self-aware and identify what information is useful, what information isn't useful, and what information is sort of a bad actor or one that's directing me in a way that is not conducive for, I guess, a positive outcome. And it allows you to take that information and utilize it in a productive manner. And I think it really ties in with a topic that I really wanted to touch on here. And you can correct me if I'm wrong if it doesn't. But you worked on a blockchain project called Holochain. And it's an open source framework for building fully distributed peer-to-peer applications that could be used from anything from small and large social coordination to social networks, supply chain, and cooperatives. But if I'm understanding this right, was one of the ideas behind Holochain to take away, I suppose, the control from these institutions such as Facebook and Twitter and break it down into a peer-to-peer structure to empower smaller communities. Would that interpretation kind of be right, or
Yes.
am I way off on this?
No, this is a great intuitive leap. That's exactly right. Yeah. There's a bit more to it, but that's definitely core. Yeah, Holochain is it's basically a small part of a much larger vision for reworking the entire architecture of computing, which would go far too far for this conversation. You will basically need a week of daily talking to a computer science PhD to understand the full scope of that. But the gist of it is that Holochain is this one of 6 parts that are doing that re-architect of computing, and it's specifically the part that deals with what people in the industry call DIDI, or distributed intrinsic data integrity. It's a mouthful, it's a lot of words, but it basically just means how do we have all this data that you and I were just talking about, this information floating around out there, be able to live on multiple computers at once without anyone being able to change the information after it has been created arbitrarily. So currently, the internet that we use, that you and I are operating this podcast over, is one of servers and clients, right? Like when you go to any website, there is a central server that holds the full and final truth of the data that the service operates on. And when you access a website, you are accessing that server, and you're both reading and generating data as you do. So when you're on Facebook, Facebook records when you're there, what you click, what you watch, how long, etc. So you're generating data that way. And also you are reading out data by seeing the posts displayed on your feed and other things. And so that data lives in the servers of Facebook, and it's also ultimately possible for them to choose what data gets to stay there, in what state it gets to stay there, and to change it if they want to. So they can censor your posts, they could potentially actually change the database entries to show that you've written something you didn't, or that you didn't write something that you actually did. Ultimately, this power can go as far as surreptitiously making you download, for example, illicit material like child porn, which is also a political strategy, by the way. But the power goes so far as determining what kind of files you have on your computer, and what the world out there, the people that you are interacting with, think that you yourself authored. So in effect, your speech on the internet is not your speech. When you're speaking, it's not directly via the medium of sound and airwaves to the ears of other people that are physically around you, but through the media, the social media, that are making these posts available to other people. And that's a problem, because it means there's a huge power asymmetry between the providers of these platforms and the users of them. And so Holochain is a way to take that data that lives between people and stretch it out from the server to all of the devices of the people that participate in a particular application, like Facebook, like Slack, whatever it may be. And blockchain that started with Bitcoin was sort of the first step in that direction that started to gain some real traction. But it didn't go far enough, and so Holochain has like all kinds of other ways of doing that are mimicking nature and biological systems that scale incredibly well, rather than sort of this machinic vision of the world of all these different parts and gears that are interlocking. But we can go into any one of these aspects. But you're exactly right. It's exactly about giving back sovereignty and agency to both the individual that participates in this digital world, as well as the group, to determine the rules by which the group operates.
So I kind of want to pause here for a second, because blockchain and crypto are typically not fully understood by the general public still, and even my own understanding of what blockchain technology is and crypto are somewhat limited. I see blockchain as a form of technology that takes away centralization and breaks it down into a multitude of nodes that are decentralized but link between each other to pass along information and to enforce validation of correct information. So if an individual inputs information onto a ledger, it's immutable and it cannot be changed. So when they send out that piece of information from their single node to another node in the network, then it adds on further information, but it can't be altered, it can't be changed, it can't be reversed. Hence, going back to your example with actors or central companies that can modify your information and manipulate it, this prevents you from doing so. In essence, it creates sort of a source of truth among a peer-to-peer network, which is kind of a way that Holochain is trying to fix what is wrong with the current Internet of Things. Realistically here, we're trying to rewind the clock and put in place structures that allow us to have an internet that operates with correct information, with information that isn't manipulated or changed.
Yes.
Things of that nature. And I think that's really important for the audience to understand.
Yes.
Because a lot of the understanding of what cryptocurrency and blockchain is Bitcoin, which is something that increased in value. So people immediately were catched by its attention. And that's simply it. But no one, I can't say no one, but a large part of the masses don't really understand what the underlying purpose of blockchain technology is, which is to take information from a centralized network and to give it back to the people by allowing information to move privately and securely without fear of it being manipulated or changed. Would that... Oh, I want to make sure that that's the correct assumption here.
That's a beautiful thread. Yes, exactly.
So that brings me to my follow-up question, which is, what separates Holochain from other blockchain technologies out there? And I can't speak on all of them, but I'm sure there are some that have similar goals, whether it be peer-to-peer encrypted privacy, exchange of cash privately from one country to another, but there's different purposes or applications for these technologies. So what exactly separates Holochain from most others?
Yeah, you're right. Like there's a whole set of goals that people try to set blockchain to, and it's kind of funny because blockchain started out as a specific solution to a specific problem. So the problem was, how do you have cash or money flow between people where there's no central authority, no central ledger that is built and maintained and operated by a central entity, like a bank, like a federal bank, like any kind of other institution, a government. And so Bitcoin came about through the development of the blockchain as a way to do that. And then, like the first couple of years of Bitcoin's existence, nobody actually took much note of blockchain. Like the term wasn't even invented. It was just this weird thing that makes Bitcoin work. And as Bitcoin started to gain value and started to become a central object of attention for a specific kind of people, blockchain became more of a word that people recognized and that they then started to try to apply to other things. And so that's how we sort of ended up in this weird world where people have this rush of fundraising and blockchain this and blockchain plus VR and blockchain plus AI. And so this buzzword that they're using to gain money and to build these projects. And so that's sort of what the trend was. And Holochain wasn't it didn't start from the problem of how do you move money around without a central authority. That wasn't the starting point. And that's crucial because the starting point generally determines where you end up as well. So Holochain, as I said, was part of a larger project that has a much larger vision for what it wants to achieve. And then its particular role in that project is that of distributed intrinsic data integrity, which is coincidentally also what blockchain achieves, albeit in a different architectural way. And so I'll spare the audience the technical details here, but I will sort of give a rough explanation of what the pieces are of it and tie it to things that the audience will most likely have some experience with. So virtually everybody has downloaded, at least probably the audience of your podcast, a torrent file at one point, like a movie or a CD or some kind of program for your computer by going onto a torrent site and downloading it via something called BitTorrent or similar programs. And so that's one piece of it, one central technology, which is a distributed hash table. I won't go much deeper into that. Another part is hash chains, which are not blockchains, but hash chains. So blockchains basically batch entries together, which is why they're called blockchains. And then hash chains are the original version of that, which is where single entries of information are tied to each other. And that's also what makes sites or services or technologies like Git and GitHub work. Mm-hmm. And then there's some fancy validation logic, similar to also how Bitcoin does something where they validate whether a transaction was valid, although in this case it's not necessarily transactions, but interactions, which is a crucial difference as well. And then also the regular private public key cryptography, which is the way that you encrypt data streams and information for the internet. And so those couple of technologies thrown together and architected in a specific way build something that is much less akin to that machine that I talked about earlier, but more akin to a body or an animal or an organism. And so actually the language that we use in this space is also biological because it lends itself or it borrows concepts from that world. For example, the rules of each application are called its DNA. And the subparts of each application are called zomes, as short for chromosomes. And so we're using that language because it directly is inspired, the technology is directly inspired by the way that our bodies, our cells, or natural systems operate, cooperate, and coordinate. And I'll give you a very concrete example to make this visual and embodied. Your body, you as a person, are a massive collection of trillions and trillions of cells, where actually I think the larger part of the biomass that makes up you isn't even your own DNA. Like your gut bacteria, all those things are not even your own DNA. So there's a bunch of different organisms in you that are not you, but that still are you in some sense. And so all of those trillions and trillions of cells that make up your muscles and your bones and all those things, they are coordinating on that scale to form exactly and make possible what is you, what you're doing right now, speaking intelligently over the internet and anticipating ideas and forming these conversation threads. Like, that's an incredible feat of intelligence and foresight and structure. And that's only possible because all of those parts of you, those minuscule parts, are cooperating on that scale. And so they're not writing their ideas to a central ledger. There's no central database in your body that records what the state of each of your component parts is, right? Like that would just
Right.
be incomprehensible and preposterous to even propose. But yet we think that this architecture that we are historically stuck with on the internet of having central servers carry all this information, we think that that is the normal and natural way that the internet and computers even generally work. And so Holochain says that's not the case. Like in order for us to gain that extreme coordination capacity that these cells in our bodies have and port that skill and that capacity from the biological world to the digital and social world enabled by the internet, we need to take our lessons from these natural systems and architect our technology in the same way. And so that's what Holochain does, and that's what Holochain is, and that's why it also is very different from other technologies, because it doesn't start from this idea of how do I move tokens around and how do I have them grow in value for me, but how do I coordinate with other people in a shared space with a shared set of rules so that we can each get ours or get mine and grow ours. And that's sort of the conceptual essence of what Holochain is about, that it makes possible for the individual to get mine and for the community or the group to get ours, to grow ours. And so those are actually the two strategies that you can pursue if you want to live a good life, is to either try to maximize your own success or to increase the pie, if you will, right? Get your own slice or increase the pie.
I think that's really well put, and overall it looks like Holochain its architecture is based off not what we perceive to be from the internet, but what it actually should be based off biological structures. I like how you mentioned that the zones are related to chromosomes and how the architecture is kind of in parallel with that, and how all the underlying configurations and structures of the technology really are derived from what we can find in nature to build an internet of sorts, or a symbiotic relationship amongst these different applications that could be built from a perspective of nature and how they really should be. And I think really what the larger point is, hammering it down, is that it really takes the information away from a centralized source and allows people to communicate and transfer information in smaller subsets of peer-to-peer networks in such a way that's built off of natural biology as opposed to what is synthetic with Bitcoin or the blockchain technology in general. So overall, I think that's a very well put way of explaining the concept of Holochain. And I know we're running up on time here, and I want to get to the closing questions for the show, but one last question as it pertains to Holochain, and that is there a specific use case? Is there a specific use case that you are most interested to see come about from the development of decentralized applications under Holochain?
Absolutely. Yeah, I just want to, before I say that, answer that, I want to reiterate that the problems that we discussed earlier in this conversation, like being manipulated by people with their own interests and with massive power, and other problems of people being not able to operate their own mind and their own body and their own information consumption, all of those things are both cause and symptoms of what some people call sort of this meta crisis of this state of affairs in the world where like everything is sort of spiraling out of control. Like a lot of things are getting worse over time, and nobody really seems to be able to get a grasp on how to approach this multitude of problems that are each exacerbating each other and are just getting worse over time. Like we have climate change, we have political polarization, we have economic stagnation, we have inequality, we have religious fundamentalism, etc. There's all these problems in the world that are spiraling out of control, and there's not really a way to approach all of them at the same time. And yet there might be. And so I'm going to propose what is essentially a pretty preposterous notion, but I nonetheless intuit, I can't prove, but I intuit that this is potentially the case, which is that if we figure out a way to run our information economy, the logistics of information, by giving people, for one, the fundamental personal skill to navigate their own emotions, their own body and mind, then the tools that they need to extend that basic agency and sovereignty into the world, then the ability to connect with other people and form groups or holds of people that display those same characteristics on the group level, and then turn those groups towards the solution of problems that are out there in the world by gathering information, performing experiments, learning from as you go, and then actually making progress on them and supporting each other, then you can actually solve all those problems out there over time and counteract this spiraling meta crisis, let's say. And I'm bringing that up because that is fundamentally, I think, what people want to care about but can't, because they're stuck in the particularities, the particular problems of their own life that force them to take a narrower view of what is important. Because of course you got to put food on the table, you got to take care of your kids, you got to help your parents, you got to be part of the community. There are all these things that keep us locked in the here and now, or sometimes the anticipated bad future, that we don't even try to aim for greater things. And so Holochain is part of a push towards making the information ecology have integrity again, have it fundamentally be unmanipulable, because it's just ineffective and ineconomic to do so, and through that provide a set of tools to people that allow them to cast the rules by which they as a group want to play into a technological form, and then to hold each other and themselves accountable to that set of rules, so that nobody ends up being pushed into or being even able to exploit others or themselves, and instead be supportive of each other's skills and capacities, and also mindful of their own needs. And so that's really what is behind that. And so the key application is not really a killer app, or how the people in the Holochain world like to call it, a mother app, but more a way of doing things that can be applied to all kinds of areas. But if I had to pick one, there are two things that are happening in this realm that I find absolutely fascinating, and that I think are candidates for this category, which is one, an app called CRISPR. I'll say what that is in a second. And another one that is called Acorn. And so CRISPR is, again, biological language. The regular use of that term is for a technology that allows you to edit genes. It's for genetic editing, basically. And porting this language into the Holochain world, the developer of this app, previously on the Holochain team, used it because the app that he's building is a combined application runtime where you can run Holochain apps within, and a code editor simultaneously. And so when you take this, you can run code in it, and you can change code in it. And that means that when you run an app in it, you can change the code of the app that you run. And so you have the capacity to use this app, but also change it and to build it into something that better fits what you want to do. And not only that, you can also then combine it with other apps to form new and different interfaces. And I'll give you a very concrete example. You know how Kanban works, right?
Kanban as an agile methodologies?
Well, Kanban is specifically like this way of segmenting tasks into to-do, doing, and done, right? And you have sort of 3 different columns, and then some people extend this out, and agile is one way of doing that. And so there's a Kanban Holochain app that exists and that people can run in CRISPR. And so what Philip shows in this beautiful video is how you can run the app and share data and tasks with other people who also run the app on their own devices. So you have shared perspective on the same data. But then you on your own device can add in a small plugin that gives you, for each task, a 5-star rating capacity that allows you to assign priorities towards these tasks just for yourself, not for the other people that are also viewing the same data. So that means you're changing the way that you're interfacing with the data, and you're making it valuable for you to fit with the way that you like to use your information, your data. And not only that, you can then also share how you're doing that with other people, and then they can do the same thing. And so you have this sort of evolutionary process at work here, where somebody tries something small out, it works for them, they share it with other people, and suddenly it becomes a new way of working. And so that's, I think, a key candidate for a mother app, if you want. And the other one is the state of affairs trees, or the Acorn app, which is the casting into Holochain code of the specific methodology of the way that Holochain and Holo as organizations work. And so Holochain and Holo as organizations are distributed across the globe. They don't have a central office. Virtually nobody works with each other in a shared space, except periodically to come together on small teams to make progress on something. And so in that context, we and they noticed that the conventional methodologies in the startup world, like Agile or Scrum, don't really work that well for this context. Like Agile and Scrum usually presuppose that you are regularly meeting people or are even constantly in the same space as them. And so they came up with this framework and methodology that they call state of affairs trees, which basically takes the overarching goal of the organization, puts it at the top of a canvas, of like a spatial canvas, like a whiteboard, basically. And the original version of this was in a tool called Miro, Miro.com. And then decompose this overarching goal, this overarching vision, very much like Elon Musk, into component parts, and more component parts, and more component parts, and more component parts. And so the name state of affairs means that you specify, you write out what is the state of affairs in the world that you want to reach. Like, what's the reason for you to do this thing?
I see.
And when you clarify that, you then keep that around as the standard by which you judge what other things that you're doing are, and you keep direct visual connections between the overarching goal of what you're trying to achieve and the most minute small thing that you're doing in the day-to-day on a technical level, so that you always know why it is that you need to care about this thing, and then also to constantly change the way of breaking out these different things, because you realize, oh, actually the thing that I was just working on, I don't even need to do that because this other thing higher up in the hierarchy is actually not even relevant. We just were thinking about the problem wrong. And so the people who are building Acorn have taken this process and built it into a Holochain app, and you can already use it now, and I'm playing with it as well. And I think that would be another candidate.
I think those are really awesome different ways that Holochain can be used, and even your second explanation was very beautifully said and kind of added another layer of clarity on top of your initial explanation of Holochain. Just real quick on state of affairs trees, the idea behind it and as to why it's better than Scrum or Agile is because it acts as a guiding light or focus point for which all of your underlying goals and features and tasks roll up to. So it tells you why or what the purpose is for every single small goal and how it really rolls up into a larger vision. And I know it ties back early in our conversation to that conversation about Elon Musk, how a lot of his technologies, whether it be Tesla or Neuralink or SpaceX, they all might be smaller goals on a canvas that really roll up to a larger goal of reaching Mars and making it habitable for humans. It's the idea of structuring something in such a way that you have an underlying reason, because that's what people really need. People need a motivation. They need an underlying reason to be doing something. So this gives that structure by keeping people on that track to know the purpose of why they're doing what they're doing.
Right. And crucially, it gives them a shared view of the entire structure. And this means that the distinction between managers and bosses and workers partially breaks down, because it means everybody or most people have access to most information. Not everybody to everything, but most people to most stuff, which means that you're building an awareness of the things that are sort of just at the edge of the things you're currently caring about. And that also means that you are constantly aware of and able to grow into the directions of the edges, and to not be reliant on the direction of other people. So you are able to self-directedly work and to cooperate with other people, because you share the view of the stuff that matters with the other people, rather than taking orders or commands from people who are organizing information and then filtering it and then passing down abstracted away and stripped of context commands. And so this means, as a company that is in a distributed, is working in distributed fashion, and that doesn't rely on central leaders to organize everything, although there's still, of course, differentials in terms of managing versus technical solution problem solving, it makes it possible for the organization as such to make better use of all the skills and capacities of the individuals that it's made up of, rather than reducing them to a sort of cog in the machine function and losing access to all the intelligence that they otherwise would bring to the table if they just knew how.
It's breaking down the corporate structure and building one or replacing it with one that empowers the individual with a unifying goal.
Right.
So we are coming up on 3 hours here, and before we close, because I know we have 6 minutes left before we hit that, is I want to ask you 5 closing questions, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, Moritz. So we'll just jump right into it. Question number 1 is, what would your 3 keys be to writing down and organizing notes that maximize output? And just for context here, like I've mentioned earlier, I personally find myself using OneNote every single day, though one of the challenges I face is with keeping information archived in a way that is easy to manage and easy to use or to make sense of. So personally speaking, outside of the second brain, what are your personal 3 keys to writing down strong notes?
First, is capturing the context in which you felt the need to write down this note. So when I write down the note, I write, okay, I wrote this down because X, which is really helpful. Then um, relating it to other notes if possible or where applicable. And then the third one would be to touch it again at some point in the future and refine it in some way, shape, or form. So, or add some kind of comment to the raw material that you captured from another source.
Number 2, for people that want to step out of a 9-to-5 job and into more of a nomadic, I should say, style of work, or one that is more enabling to allow them to touch on different areas and expand their exposure to other creative endeavors, what advice would you give them? And I think it's also important to give context here. In my case, I decided to use my podcast as a medium or platform to challenge myself and to do something that not only interests me, but to improve my communication and web development and marketing skills, for instance.
So I would say it is to learn how to capture information. No, I'll step outside the sort of second brain thing. It's learn how to connect with people, and that can take whatever form that you want. It can be social, it can be like through the internet, it can be through sports, whatever it may be. That's absolutely key. And learn how to articulate what you feel and think well by paying attention to where your body tells you you're lying or you're not actually believing that. I think it's a powerful thing that when you tune your awareness to where you're making a leap that you can't support or that you can't that you're not 100% sure you can land, to be aware of that and to take note of it and to return to it at some point and try to investigate it.
Of all of your experiences up to this point, has there been one takeaway or lesson that has helped you accomplish work in the most efficient and productive manner?
Yes, it's knowing when to walk away from work.
Although the technology is still relatively in its infancy, what is one thing you are most excited to see come about from the adoption of blockchain technology in the next few years?
It's the rise of these sort of cybernetic collectives and a return to a middle age, a medieval age way of organizing society where there's a sort of, it's more of a community oriented life rather than a corporation oriented life. And the return also to a relationship with the land rather than with society only, where people start to learn again and become physically enmeshed with the fabric of nature rather than the fabric of society.
And then the final question, Moritz. If you had a chance to write a message on a billboard that would be visible to hundreds of thousands of people, what would your message convey?
Ooh. I don't know what it would convey, but I would probably make it something like a smiley or something that doesn't have a message, but that is infinitely interpretable by each viewer and that breaks the assumption of what that message should be. Like billboards usually like want to sell you something. I want to put up a billboard that wants you to like buy yourself or something like that.
You know, You're the first guest on my show out of 25 guests. I'm pretty sure I've asked this question, at least in some variation, to those individuals. But you're the first person to convey a message that is more of a symbol than it is a line of text or specific words. So I will say that you did step outside of the box on that, and I do think that answer is incredibly. No, I love the answer. So well done.
Thank you.
So we are, it looks like, at 3 hours now, and before I go, I know we've talked about a ton of topics here, and you've shared a lot of incredibly insightful information, Moritz. But before we go, for those out there that are interested in learning more about you, the work you do, reaching out to you on social media, or even connecting with you, where would you direct them?
So my preferred way for you to get in touch with me would be to write me an email at moritzbierling@hey.com. And you can find the spelling of my name in the podcast title, I assume, or in the description. And then if you feel like being more permanently sort of in touch or aware of what I do and the updates that I share with people, then definitely follow me on the social media of your choice. I'm on nearly all of them. And yeah, in the future, I might get back to building a website for myself again. For now, I'll stick to what I have. And I would definitely prefer the direct contact. And yeah, I think if you want to dive deeper into the world of what we discussed in this conversation, you can also find a couple of, or plenty of actually, interviews and conversations and videos that I've produced myself on YouTube under my name. And then we can have an informed conversation from there. But please do get in touch if any of these threads pulled on you, and share what you found interesting. And I'll be happy to either direct you to other resources or have a conversation with you, or just engage on these things.
And for listeners out there, I will be adding links in the description relative to the conversation we had, some of the topics, books recommended, workshops, and some of the individuals that we cited as well in the conversation, if you're interested in taking a look at those as well. So again, Moritz, it's been literally an incredible conversation. I think this has been the longest episode I have done up to this point, and I've enjoyed every single minute of it. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and convey and share and discuss all of these incredible thoughts and ideas that you have to share with the world.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Tesher. Thank you for inviting me onto the show, and I look forward to listening to the next episode.
All right, so that will do it for this episode of the All Things Interesting podcast. Thank you.